chair recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Sutton, to offer an amendment. Has this amendment pertain to Title I, and has it, first of all, does this amendment apply to this title?
It does, Mr. Chairman.
And let me ask the clerk, has this amendment met the time requirement?
It has, Mr. Chairman.
Will the clerk report the amendment?
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2454, offered by Ms. Sutton of Ohio, Mr. Inslee of Washington, Mr. Dingle of Michigan, Mr. Stupak of Michigan, and Mr. Braley of Iowa. Insert after Section 127 the following new section. Section 128, Temporary Vehicle Trade-In Program.
Or is that it? Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Does the chair recognizes the gentlelady from
Mr. Chairman,
Ohio?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
The gentleman reserves his point of order. Would you like to make your point of order at this time?
I'll reserve it.
Okay. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment will create a fleet modernization, also known as Cash for Clunkers Temporary Vehicle Trade-In Program. And as I begin my remarks, I want to thank my colleagues on the committee who have joined me as co-sponsors, Representative Inslee, Chairman Emeritus Dingle, Representative Stupak, and Braley. I also want to thank Chairman Waxman and Chairman Markey for working so hard to develop this compromise proposal, and thank Congresswoman Candace Miller and Congressman Fred Upton for working on this concept. This Cash for Clunkers program will assist consumers to buy or lease new vehicles that are more fuel efficient. This program will help consumers, it will also improve our environment, it will also reduce our dependence on foreign oil, stimulate our economy, and help our domestic auto and related industries. Now, over the last few months, auto sales have greatly suffered. As you know, these are not ordinary times, and we must always remember that our workers are the ones who are truly suffering. And just last week, a Ford assembly plant in my district in Avon Lake informed employees that between 250 and 300 workers may be laid off as the company further aligns capacity with demand. Now, this program has the potential to help change that and alleviate this and further job loss in our very important auto sector upon which so many families in this country depend. And this amendment, this fleet modernization Cash for Clunkers concept, will help increase demand by providing consumers with vouchers toward the purchase of a lease of a new vehicle. And here are the details. Consumers must trade in a vehicle with a maximum combined city highway fuel economy of 18 miles per gallon or less to be eligible for the program. Eligible consumers will receive a $3,500 voucher toward the lease or purchase of a passenger car with the mileage improvement of at least 4 miles per gallon. If a consumer purchases or leases a passenger car that achieves at least 10 miles per gallon improvement over the trade-in, they will receive a $4,500 voucher. Light-duty trucks, both small and large, also qualify under this program. Small light-duty trucks must have a base of 18 miles per gallon with a mileage improvement of at least 2 miles per gallon over the trade-in to be eligible for a $3,500 voucher. If the small light-duty truck's mileage improvement is at least 5 miles per gallon over the trade-in vehicle, a consumer will qualify for a $4,500 voucher. Large light-duty trucks, those over 6,000 to 8,500 pounds, must have a base of 15 miles per gallon with at least a 1 mile per gallon improvement to be eligible for a $3,500 voucher. If the large light-duty truck's mileage improvement is at least 2 miles per gallon over the trade-in vehicle, a consumer will qualify for a $4,500 voucher. And work trucks also qualify, which will assist small businesses replace older, more polluting work trucks. This amendment will accelerate fuel savings nationwide and boost auto sales. Countries around the world have adopted Cash for Clunkers plans. Just yesterday, the United Kingdom kicked off their Cash for Clunkers program. And for the month of March, Germany's program boosted sales by 40%. A 40% increase, while new vehicle sales in the U.S. are down by nearly 40%. Last month, vehicle sales in the U.S. fell to below 9 million vehicles from 17.5 million in 2005. Auto sales have not been in such a decline since 1955, and this decline jeopardizes our country's largest manufacturing industry and the millions of related jobs. But by adopting this amendment, we can preserve jobs and protect the environment at the same time. Now, recently, President Obama announced that the General Services Administration will accelerate its purchase of 17,600 new fuel-efficient vehicles with the overall goal of at least a 10% increase in fuel efficiency. I applaud his leadership and his decision that only vehicles produced by American auto companies will be part of a GSA program. This program, however, is open to all manufacturers, which is part of the compromise, to ensure that this program is not delayed by WTO challenges so that consumers can begin to benefit. But I echo President Obama's comments from his April 30th address and encourage all Americans, when considering buying a car, to buy one made in the United States. Your neighbors, your friends, and our communities who depend on a tax base need us to do this. This amendment is supported by the United Auto Workers, Ohio's Governor Ted Strickland, the governors of Michigan, Colorado, Delaware, Illinois, Kansas, Kentucky, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, Vermont, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. Ford, GM, and Chrysler support this compromise, and President Obama has asked for Congress to send fleet modernization legislation to his desk. By passing this amendment, we will be one step closer. We will be one step closer to reducing oil consumption in this country and improving emissions. And we will be one step closer to preserving jobs during this recession. I urge members of this committee to join with us in supporting this amendment, and I yield back my time.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have a major problem with this amendment. In fact, I have an amendment that's almost identical at the desk. It has a few minor differences, and I want to engage in a colloquy with the author of the amendment, if she'd be willing to do that.
Certainly.
Congresswoman Sutton, I've reviewed your amendment on cash for clunkers. I agree with many of the items contained in your amendment. I have some concerns about the language in the amendment, specifically the proposed new subparagraph 128J7C that requires clunker vehicles that are being traded into a dealer to achieve not more than 18 miles per gallon. In my estimation, this is an arbitrary and unwieldy requirement for the trade-in vehicle. I'm not aware of any study that's pegged this number as the right number. To avoid cumbersome calculations and encourage as many trade-in vehicles as possible, would it be possible for you to modify your amendment to remove the 18-mile-per-gallon standard and replace it with a standard that the clunker car be at least 8 years or older? I would think this would be fairer and gets more newer vehicles on the road, which I believe is what your goal is. Under the rules of the House and this committee, I cannot offer an amendment to your amendment. You, however, can make a unanimous consent request to amend your own amendment. If you're willing to make this change, I believe that we could pass your amendment unanimously. I would yield to you for any response you might wish to make.
I thank the gentleman for the question, and I appreciate the sentiment. Of course, as I introduced this proposal in its early days, I had a provision very comparable to what you suggest. After a lot of work to get this initiative to a place where we're going to pass it and we're going to get the benefits underway. That was not part of what was included in the compromise, and so I think that at this moment, at least we need to deal with what we have before us and move ahead and start to provide consumers with this relief, get the jobs shored up, stimulate our economy, and so that is how I would respond, although I am sympathetic to the notion.
Okay. Well, reclaiming my time, I'm disappointed that you wouldn't be willing to make that change, because I think it would make it much simpler, but I understand if you're not willing to. I still think this is an amendment that is worthy of support. I will point out that the Barton amendment that's been worked on with Mr. Upton and Mr. Rogers and others is very similar. It's also much simpler to implement. And I guess in the interest of full disclosure, I'd have to admit that I have a clunker car that's 8 years older. So I would have benefited had I'm not sure how many miles per gallon my own car gets, but probably not 18. I'm probably okay either way. Anyway, I do compliment the gentlelady for her amendment. I think the Barton-Rogers-Upton amendment is preferable, but certainly this is a step in the right direction.
Gentleman's time has expired. Seeking recognition, Mr. Barton, I gather that was your time that you were speaking on? So on the Democratic side, anybody?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Dingell.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I commend the gentlewoman for her offering of this amendment, which is best titled the Fleet Modernization Amendment, and I congratulate her for her leadership in the matter. The amendment has the support of the Obama administration, the governor of the state of Michigan, the International Union of Auto Workers, Aerospace, and Agricultural Implement Workers, the UAW, Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors. It is something that has worked in California. It is something that has worked in Germany. It produces sales, but it gets old cars, dirty cars, inefficient cars off the market. It will encourage people to go in and to buy cars at a time when that is very much needed. I express to you my thanks, as well as my thanks to Mr. Markey, Mr. Stupak, of course, Representative Sutton, and Representative Inslee for the collaborative and collegial approach that each of you have fostered during the negotiations. The amendment as now constituted represents a fine value balance between environmental and economic concerns, something which I believe each and every member of this committee can and should report. In view of the unprecedented turmoil faced by the domestic automakers and the growing imperative to halt global warming, Representative Sutton's Fleet Modernization Amendment stands out as a very practical and effective mechanism by which to achieve consumer savings, reduce fuel consumption, lower carbon dioxide and criteria pollutant emissions, and increase sales from a critical sector in the national economy. I thank you for your courtesy, Mr. Chairman, and I close by strongly urging my colleagues to vote in favor of Representative Sutton's eminently sensible amendment. And with 3 and 10 seconds left, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Dingell. Further recognition on the amendment. Mr. Upton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure I'll use my full 5 minutes. I too, want to sign up in support of this amendment. I would join my colleague, Mr. Barton, and I think we could have made it a better bill and a simpler bill for consumers to understand, though I understand this is the best that we have, and therefore I'm a strong supporter. One question I have to the author, it's my understanding that EPA has a website, www.fueleconomy.gov, and as I understand it, it is that site that consumers can verify whether their vehicle, no matter how old, meets the 18 mile per hour or per gallon mileage. Is that correct?
That's my understanding as well.
So if the combined mileage is 18 or lower, the car will qualify. We have had a real decline in consumer confidence over the last number of months, which is one of the reasons I'm convinced that the auto sales have declined almost by 50%. Nearly 24 countries have put this type of program in. Germany is one, South Korea, even I think Lithuania has put this plan on the books. And rather than seeing the continued decline in auto sales, they have gone up. This last month for all sales here in the U.S., whether it be a transplant like Toyota or whether it be a GM, Chrysler, Ford, their sales actually declined, some of them by as much as 40% over the previous year. The countries that have installed this type of program have seen double-digit increases, no longer double-digit declines. And that's why this amendment, I think, is very important. And one of the troubles that we've had, the President announced his support for a provision like this last March. Well, we now have a number of consumers across the country saying, where is it? They've got a clunker, whether it be Mr. Barton's or somebody else's. They've got one, they want to take it in, but they're looking for that tipping point to be able to get that discount on that vehicle from the dealer. And so I might just ask the chairman, Mr. Waxman, if we're able to pass this amendment this afternoon, knowing full well that the underlying bill won't likely get to the president for some time, is there a possibility that we might spring this amendment separately so that to those consumers that are perhaps waiting to get that best deal on their GM or Chrysler, hopefully they're back, Ford, Toyota, Honda, if they might have some assurance that by the 15th of June or something like that, we can actually get a bill to the president knowing that he stands in full support of this amendment.
The gentleman, yield to me. I think you make a good case, and I'm going to consider it. On the other hand, this does help move this bill forward because I think it makes the bill even stronger. But I will certainly be glad to talk to you further about it, and others as well, because I think you have set out some good reasons.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Any further discussion? Who's seeking recognition? Yes. Mr. Braley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My uncle, Lyle Nesrod, was a Chevrolet dealer in my hometown of Brooklyn, Iowa for about 60 years. And that dealership no longer exists, in large part because of what's happening to our domestic automobile industry. Many rural automobile dealers sell pickup trucks and light-duty trucks that are defined in the Act as Category 1 trucks, Category 2 trucks, which includes large vans or large pickup trucks, and work trucks, which are Category 3 trucks. So the reason why I wanted this Cash for Clunkers bill introduced and why I was proud to be one of the sponsors of this bill is because of what's happened to automobile dealers all over this country. It's had a devastating impact on our communities, a devastating impact on our economy, and we need this bill to purchase new fuel-efficient cars and trucks and help boost our economy and save American jobs. That's why on March 17th, I was proud, along with Congresswoman Sutton, to introduce similar legislation, the Consumer Assistance to Recycle and Save Cars Act, and I'm pleased that the administration has supported this concept and that we now have some very good compromise language that's going to address the balanced views of the auto industry and environmentalists alike. And Congresswoman Sutton has explained the mechanics of this program, but it's very important to note that this concept that we're talking about, Cash for Clunkers, fits in perfectly with the American Clean Energy and Security Act because it will save American jobs, boost our economy, and decrease our dependence on foreign oil. It also achieves the multiple goals of giving consumers a break to purchase more fuel-efficient vehicles, while we all benefit from a reduction of greenhouse gases and save American jobs by jump-starting the auto industry. And we know this works. As Congresswoman Sutton mentioned, Germany, in the last month, had a 40% increase in its sales of vehicles just from a year ago, and in February had a 20% improvement. This bill will make a difference in our economy. It will save families money and decrease our dependence on foreign oil, and that's why I encourage all of my colleagues to support it. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Braley. Any further discussion? Mr. Shadegg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I probably won't take 5 minutes either. I just want to ask a couple of questions of the sponsor of the amendment. She indicated that it would apply only to American-made automobiles. I'm looking for the language that defines American-made, or if you could clarify that for me, please. I'd be happy to yield.
Thank you. Actually, that is what I said, so you might have misunderstood what I said. This bill is open to cars manufactured outside of the U.S. as well. It certainly is a bill that will allow our domestic auto manufacturers to robustly participate, which was a critical component of making sure that this program was going to have the desired effect, because shoring up jobs in the domestic auto industry is a key component of this bill.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. Second, on page 18 of the bill, it says that the term qualifying lease means a lease of an automobile for a period of not less than 5 years. It's my understanding that many automobile leases are for 3 and 4 years. Is there a reason why that was selected, and are you amenable to a change to that, or is there a policy decision behind 5 years? And I'd be happy to yield again.
I thank the gentleman. Again, it is all part of the balance of this bill to ensure that we have we are open to participation that allows, obviously, us to be compliant with our obligations under the WTO, but also allows all of our manufacturers to participate robustly. And so 5 years was the amount of time that those who were actively involved in drafting the bill came up with.
So, reclaiming my time. So, if some company engages in lots of leases of 3 years or 4 years, they apparently weren't involved in those negotiations, and you're not open to changing that term?
Again, I can't really say that they weren't involved in the negotiations. There were certainly a discussion about all of these provisions, and this is the consensus compromise that was reached to get this program off the ground, to make sure that all of those out there, all who participate in dealers who sell cars of every stripe can participate. So that's what I'm saying to you. We had a lot of input from people from various corners, and so I'm sure that they were involved.
Thank you very much for claiming my time. So it does not apply to leases of under 5 years. My next question is, there appears to be no income exclusion, so the amount of income of the individual who brings in the clunker is not a factor. It wouldn't matter if they were a multi-billionaire?
Again, while I'm sympathetic to that idea and certainly have discussed it, there is a limit on the price of the automobile of $45,000,
right.
And that is intended to deal with the same issue that you're raising.
But no limit on the income of the...
That is correct.
Okay. My last question goes to page 19. It talks about an authorization of appropriations of, I believe, $4 billion. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Has there been an estimate or a calculation of the take-up rate at the at the prices per vehicle of the subsidy? And could you explain to the committee how the figure of $4 billion was derived? Or if council could do that, since council...
Basically, this program is intended to provide for about 1 million cars.
Council, do you know how the figure of $4 billion was selected? And is there reason to believe that will cover all the cars?
The number was picked based on consultation with the administration's economists and taking a look at what other programs in other countries had done. And the best estimate we could come up with for the program was approximately over the year it would be authorized would be about 1 million cars that would be taken up, with about an average voucher of about $4,000 each.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I'd
be happy to yield to the gentleman from Texas.
I'm going to ask a question of the author of the amendment, because I'm very supportive, but I had, in the Barton amendment, we don't have a requirement that you only participate if you get a 5-year lease. You don't have if somebody purchases a car under this program, they can purchase it with cash, they can purchase it for any length of time, and there's no limitation. Why do you have a 5-year lease requirement? I don't understand the policy. Yeah, but what I'm saying is, if you purchase, there's no requirement. The length of the loan repayment, why do we have a requirement the only ones that qualify if they lease it is for 5 years? Because
would gentlemen yield on that point?
I'll be happy to yield, whoever can answer.
When we're doing the negotiations on this part, this really puts leases on the same footing as the new car purchasers. The average new car is, financed for a 5-year period. So we felt it would be unfair if you allowed someone to receive $4,500 voucher for about a 2 or 3 year lease. They really wouldn't have any investment in it, because it would mean the voucher would almost cover the entire cost of the lease. So then the consumer could just turn around and get another clunker. So that's why we made it 5, so it's same as the new car. Manufacturers do offer 5-year leases. You can get a 5-year lease. Right. So we made it even, so it's even footing with a new car. And we're afraid if you did for every 2 or 3 years, you got $4,500, you'd have nothing invested. You'd just cover the cost of your lease and no other investment into it.
Well, I don't know how. I mean, I know that this has been negotiated, but I would hope that we could have some ability to change that before this bill goes, if it goes somewhere, because there are a lot of people that lease for 3 years, and in the case of a congressional lease, it has to be for 2 years if you lease a congressional vehicle. And I guarantee you, the lease cost per month of a $40,000 vehicle is over $1,000 a month. So you're going to have more than $4,500 invested. So it's a minor point, but
but time has expired.
Just 30 seconds.
Yes, gentlemen.
You can't do it out of your office account because you got to be the registered applicant who's licensed in that.
I'm just saying that I don't think any congressman would try to lease a congressional.
Well, I just want to make sure. I don't want to do oversight on that.
But there are many people who do want to lease a vehicle for less than 5 years.
Yeah, but
you don't put a requirement in the Sutton Amendment that you have to, if you don't pay cash, you have to have a loan for 5 years.
But if you're turning your car over every 2 or 3 years, that's not really clunkers. Plus, the idea is I don't want someone just to get a $4,500 lease so they don't have any financial investment in this lease. I mean, we're not doing it just to make sure you have a nice updated car. Go ahead.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I might ask just one additional minute.
Without objection.
I just might note that in reading the bill, there is a sunset provision, number one, only 1 year, and number two, that an owner is only eligible to do this one time. So that would prevent...
A registered owner.
Correct. Only
so it could be you and your wife.
Well, that would be 2 owners if the car was...
how's the car registered? That's sort of the key.
That's how it depends. So one owner, one listing of the owner, whether it's joint ownership or what.
Correct.
But it also has only a one-year sunset, so it sunsets next March.
True.
It'll be less than 1 year. And only one vehicle at a time, so only one vehicle. You can't turn in 2 clunkers for one new vehicle or one lease.
We ready for the question? Mr. Terry, you wanted to speak on this. Oh.
Yeah, thank you. In regard to the initial discussion by Ranking Member Barton on age versus mileage, I would encourage us to continue this discussion. If you look at the EPA's fuel economy website that Mr. Upton mentioned, I've looked at that, and what you find on this website by the EPA is that age of a car is directly related to the amount of emissions. And I thought that was what this bill was about, was reducing the CO2 emissions. For example, from memory on this website, you can take a 4-year-old 4-cylinder like my Camry, and from the 04 version to the 08 or 09 version, you have almost a 60% reduction of emissions. So basing it on the number or the age of the vehicles actually lowers emissions more than by fuel standards alone. So I'm wondering if that type of discussion occurred amongst the authors of this discussion, if they felt that they could actually accomplish more by the age. And I would yield to Ms. Sutton or any of the other authors. All right, I'll come back. Mr. Upton, you're from Michigan. I was just wondering why none of the Republican side are co-sponsors. You sounded supportive. Why weren't you included?
You need to ask the sponsor. I'm a co-sponsor of the bill as was introduced on the floor, and I co-sponsor with my colleague Candace Miller on this issue as it was described by Mr. Barton, and really
right. I now have 2 questions for you. One is, you're eating up my time.
Sure. I apologize. Yes, obviously this issue has been discussed, and as I said, it was drafted that way when I introduced the CARS Act on the floor. Again, this bill is intended to have multiple goals. which can't be sacrificed. Certainly, the jobs component is uppermost in my mind, and I think in the outcome on this measure. We also do want to achieve environmental integrity as well as helping those consumers when they need it the most. And I know that you know as well as I do how much they need it out there. So it really is a matter of some things remained and some things did not, but certainly that was part of the
and
robust
the other question,
discussion.
why were none of the Republicans from auto industry area included in your amendment?
Well, I have to tell you that certainly the Representative Upton, as he made very clear, Representative Upton and Representative Miller and others have been robustly involved in the development of the concept. And
so did they turn you down?
Mr. Cherry, will you yield to me?
Yes.
I think all members of this committee will have an opportunity to express their view on this amendment, and I would hope I know we'll get Republican as well as Democratic votes.
Reclaiming my time.
It's your time.
I'm just,
I would welcome that.
Unfortunately, I just really feel that this committee has lost any of its abilities to be bipartisan. I think this is an example of it. Mr. Chairman, one of the things that I've heard from my dealers is that this provision, not specifically this one here before us, but the clunkers for cash is actually hurting business right now because people are waiting for this to pass. And since the Senate has already said they aren't taking up this bill, I'm wondering if we're hurting our dealers even more by including this in a bill that's never going to pass. I'm wondering if the Senate has agreed to pass a standalone bill, and maybe we should join them with the standalone bill. And I would recommend, Mr. Chairman, that this amendment be withdrawn, and we could bring it up as a standalone amendment and maybe do it in a bipartisan manner.
Gentlemen, yield to me?
I yield.
If we're not acting in a bipartisan way, it's not because of the reluctance on our part to ask for Republicans to be involved. We try to involve you. And you may not be for the bill. If you like this provision, you ought to vote for this provision. You like some amendments, vote for them. You don't like other amendments, vote against them. If you don't want to vote for the bill overall, then don't vote for it.
Reclaiming my time.
Members have been invited to be part of the...
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman.
It is your time.
In this instance, we have members from the Michigan delegation that are involved on another bill, including the one that Ms. Sutton's involved with, and still they weren't asked to participate.
Gentleman's time has expired. Is there further discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be short. Just a couple things. I notice in this amendment we actually have an amount of $4 billion versus in the 932-page bill, many times we have such sums as may be necessary. So I would ask the author, why did she decide to put $4 billion in the amendment and not use the terminology such sums as may be necessary?
Thank the gentleman for his question. The answer is the same. I mean, we said $4 billion because
you could
the economist suggested to us that this was the number that would cover 1 million cars if they were based at.
So you went, in part of your negotiations, you went to an economist to get a score, and you calculated that there is actually an amount out there that we could put in parameters, so when we vote for the amendment, we actually know what we're voting for in the authorization. Is that safe to say?
Yes.
Thank you. I just wish we would have done that consultation more on the 10 or 14 or 15 other places in the bill where we have the terms such sums as may be necessary. So I applaud you for doing that. The other thing, Mr. Chairman, this is $4 billion. I mean, this is not chump change, and you have me at a disadvantage because I am an owner of a clunker, and so what we're asking is really the taxpayers to provide me with $3,500 to $4,500 of their money to me to add in the price of a vehicle that has no value.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
There's no requirement that you participate in this program.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, so I will be like all the rest of Americans who will look at taking a value and having the taxpayers fund a vehicle of value which has no value. That's in essence what we're doing. And I'm at a disadvantage. I'll probably pass on this vote because I will personally benefit if and when this becomes law, and
Gentlemen, yield.
I would yield.
You don't have to take advantage of the program, but you are compelled to pay taxes to fund it.
But if I want to be a great environmental steward, Mr. Chairman, as you know I do, I would be compelled because of my great concern for the environment to move from my clunker to a more efficient light vehicle truck.
You don't have to ask us to pay for it.
Taxpayers are going to pay for it, so you don't have to.
The gentleman yield?
I would be happy to yield.
Thank you. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get you to say, okay, I'm driving a vehicle getting 12 miles a gallon. It's old. It's 15 years ago. It was another era, the era of cheap gasoline. And now, I'm going to go out and buy a 30-mile-a-gallon vehicle. And this program is going to kind of put me over the edge to break the old patterns of the kinds of vehicles which I purchased. And I think that program is the kind of program that we want people, not you necessarily, but people like you, to participate in as we turn the corner and move to this new, more fuel-efficient era.
And just to be clear, the taxpayers are helping us do that. It's the taxpayers' burden. We're asking taxpayers to fund the purchase of new cars for everyone. There's no income exclusion for everyone.
Would the gentleman yield?
I would.
Yes. The truth is, it's a win for the consumer. It's a win for backing out all the oil that otherwise we would import. And it's a win for the car dealers and getting them up and going again and buying advertising in the local papers and local TV stations and keeping their people employed. It's a win, win, win.
Well, the gentleman yield.
And the taxpayer.
Well, we hope it's a win also for the workers who are going to have their jobs, and when they're working, they'll pay taxes and they'll make this economy stronger.
As I said, Mr. Chairman, you have me at a disadvantage with this amendment. I yield back.
Thanks. Mr. Inslee?
Thank you. Just a quick point. I don't have any auto workers in my district, but I think this provision demonstrates something that is important in this bill, and that is we're all moving together, and we all recognize we got problems economically and national security, environmentally together, and we're not going to move unless we move together. And I had introduced a bill with Steve Israel that had a much more aggressive sort of green component of this bill, but we found a consensus that's going to help the country move forward together and is going to help a devastated industry move forward. And I may note that this consensus we reached has been criticized by some folks on the green side of the agenda. They've argued that it doesn't help the life cycle costs of these cars because you have to manufacture a car that has CO2 associated with it when you manufacture it. To those critics, I want to point out that the cars we're helping here get off the lot largely have already been manufactured. And it's not a life cycle cost issue. It's a cost of moving forward. This is a good amendment. I hope everybody votes for it. Thanks.
Is there further discussion of the pending amendment? Mr. Boyer.
Move to strike the last word. I just have some questions for clarification for myself. So, Ms. Sutton, I would be willing to yield to you. I'd like to make sure that I understand. This would be an American citizen of whom would own either an American-made vehicle or truck, an import, or one manufactured at a transplant automobile factory in the United States.
I'm sorry, Representative, maybe you weren't in the room when I explained it.
I was in the room. I'm asking for clarification.
Oh, okay, okay. No, this amendment is open to manufacturers both in the U.S. and beyond.
All right. All right. Now, all right, then that answers that question. Any type of vehicle that's driven on the road here in the United States, manufactured anywhere in the world, would be eligible under this.
No, that's incorrect. Would you yield? Would the gentleman yield? Well, certainly there are other parts to this amendment that there are certainly fuel emissions standards attached to it, and there are limits on the price of the vehicle that can be used, and there are other limits within the amendment.
I got it.
Okay.
I got it. Since agriculture has been exempted out of this bill, and now you've added this amendment, in order for this to be germane, are you also exempting farm trucks and grain trucks from this amendment?
No, I'm not exempting anything, and I'm not really certain about the first statement you made about agriculture or otherwise. So perhaps I'm not the right person to answer this question. Mr. Braley, however, can.
Council, would farm trucks and grain trucks be included in this under categories 2 and category 3 of the definition of trucks?
The amendment doesn't break down, doesn't specify the type of vehicle by use and which vehicles are eligible by use. Vehicles fall into categories, and there are vehicles, work trucks are eligible to be turned in and traded for and receive a voucher for purchase.
Would council please talk into the microphone?
So the council, I just want to make sure that we're not incongruent. We have a bill that exempts agriculture under cap and trade, yet there's an amendment here that will include agricultural pickup trucks and grain trucks and things that are used on the farm.
It would include any work truck up to 10,000 pounds.
Does this, a Category 3 truck to council, are these, when you say work truck Category 3, are these also dump trucks?
They're all vehicles up to 10,000, all trucks up to 10,000 pounds. I don't believe there's any dump trucks that fall into that category.
It would not be then.
These are primarily large pickup trucks.
And it doesn't matter with regard to the engine, whether it's a diesel engine or a regular gasoline. It doesn't matter, does it?
It does not, as long as it meets relevant standards.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yield. No.
You're asking me to yield?
Well, he had a minute and a half.
Mr. Boyer, have you yielded back your time, or you want to yield to Mr. Murphy? Sure.
Thank you, gentlemen. I just have a quick question for Ms. Sutton on this regarding this bill. With regard to the types of automobiles that will be involved in this, we recognize that some of the imported vehicles may come from countries that themselves have a large carbon output in their own manufacturing, et cetera, which should concern us, especially regarding the discussion we just had about manufacturing and concern about other vehicles coming over or other steel coming over, other products, and putting tariffs on them, et cetera. And I don't know if there's anything in this that actually protects if a lower priced vehicle may come from another country that has no pollution controls in their plants, et cetera. I was wondering if the gentlelady would consider putting anything in this that would restrict it to either countries that have a smaller carbon output or at least vehicles assembled in the United States. And I yield to the gentlelady for answer.
Yeah, and I thank the gentleman for his question, and I appreciate your commitment on this issue because I know that it extends beyond what we're discussing here today. The answer on this particular amendment is that is not protected in this amendment. However, I will say to you that this is not the be-all, end-all, only thing we ever have to do. And so I continue that fight with you outside the parameters of this amendment.
The fight that we're on the same side.
Yes.
Thank you. Yield back.
Time has expired.
Claim. Can I just have?
Yeah, gentlemen.
Gentlelady, one question. There are actual businesses out there, Ms. Sutton, that rent a wreck. And would it be your intention that these types of businesses do not use this provision for fleet replacement? I'm just rather curious. You know, every time we create a program, someone tries to take advantage of what we create, and I was just curious.
I'm not certain exactly how that would work with Rent-A-Wreck because when you trade in the vehicle's drivetrain and engine are destroyed. So I'm not really sure exactly what your question is.
Well, they would.
Gentlemen, yield to me.
I would.
I think Mr. Upton raised the point that, as he expressed it, This is one person, one registered owner for 1 year has this opportunity.
Okay, as opposed to a commercial individual who
correct.
may buy a fleet. Okay, that's helpful to me. Thank you very much.
Further discussion on the amendment.
Mr. Chairman.
Let's see if there's anybody on the Democratic side. Not that you have to speak.
Mr. Chairman.
And on the Republican side, not that you have to speak, but if you're seeking recognition, Mr. Walden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You wish to pursue your point of order?
No, at this point, I would request to strike the requisite number of words.
Okay, do you withdraw your point of order on this amendment?
Yes, I would withdraw my point of order.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on the.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a question of counsel. Who gets the credit for the voucher? Is there an income issue here from a tax perspective? I know when we give a tax credit for a vehicle, there's an income issue. Is there a value associated to somebody for this voucher? And if so, whom?
Right now, the amendment is silent on that issue.
So it'd be taxable.
So does that mean it's a taxable event to the dealer or to the individual?
I believe our intention is...
I can't. You got to get real close to these mics is the problem.
I believe our intention is that it would be neither.
That is your intention, but the amendment is silent. So therefore, it is, at the present time, it's a taxable event, and I assume that's the case because we lack the jurisdiction to deal with the taxable issue. Is that correct? Maybe, Ms. Sutton, that's probably better because it's more of a strategery issue
That's
here.
correct.
Then. Okay, so how do we know? Part of the reason I asked that is obviously this is designed to incent people to buy vehicles. I get that. That's easy. Just like the tax credits are for hybrid vehicles. Unfortunately, we bump up against the AMT. Some people do in America, and those who are probably going to race out and buy cars based on this have jobs and maybe the ones in the income category that will bump up against AMT, which negates the effect of, in the case of hybrids, the tax credit. You lose it. And so it doesn't help. And what I'm trying to figure out is how do you thread that needle here if you're not doing it in this bill?
We have to work with those who have the capacity to do that in other venues.
And have you had any discussions with those in other venues who have that capacity or gavel?
Yeah, that's what I meant.
And
the Ways and Means Committee.
are they willing to work with you on this?
Absolutely.
And work with you in the way that you are satisfied there will not be an AMT consequence to this bill?
Well, you know, I can't speak for them. All I can do is work with them and continue that mission. I would certainly appreciate your support as well.
Well, for this to be very effective, I would hope that would be addressed.
No, I don't think so.
Otherwise, you have a de facto income limit in the bill. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to yield my friend from Florida.
If it turns out that you have a home in which you sell it for less than the mortgage and the bank forgives the balance, you got to declare it as ordinary income. So wouldn't a taxpayer who goes in to buy a new car and gets a reduction in the price, and then the government must the government wires the money to the dealer after he shows that he sold to me this car, the money's wired, wouldn't I have to declare ordinary income on that?
It's not our intention that would be the case.
But isn't that legally, wouldn't that the IRS would say, okay, Mr. Stern's got an ordinary income. The negotiated price was, let's say, $25,000, and after this, the difference would be, I would have to pay ordinary income, wouldn't I?
I don't know, to be honest with you.
Well, how are they doing it in Germany?
I think we'd have to.
What about the author of the bill? Can she tell us what they're doing in Germany? It's been quoted that other countries are doing this. How are they doing this? Does the taxpayer does the buyer of the automobile have to pay ordinary income on the difference? Does anyone know? Either the author of the amendment or anyone? Deaf ears, okay. All right.
I need to reclaim my time for one other quick question. Is there anything in here that prevents the seller of the new vehicle from using only this voucher reduction amount as the negotiating piece. In other words, people can come in and the taxpayers are going to write down $4,500 per car, or $4,000 per car, whatever it is. Does that mean, doesn't that give the dealer then the ability to just go off list price? I, as the buyer, still am going to come in $4,000 below, and the seller of the vehicle, I know they can't charge an additional fee. I know there's a limit. Is there anything in there that says how they negotiate this deal? Looks to me like you could have a real windfall. I'd yield to my colleague.
Could I just ask, this discussion is getting a little prolonged. Can I ask an additional 2 minutes for the gentleman from Oregon?
Will that shorten the time or prolong?
I hope that it'll shorten.
I would assume it prolongs it, but it might be good.
And let me just say this.
Without objection, the gentleman would be given 2 additional minutes.
And I might say, if the gentlelady
do you wish to yield to Mr.
I suppose.
If the gentlelady from Ohio would listen, and my friend Mr. Stupak as well, is I understand this. There should be no consequence to the purchaser of the new car. The purchaser is going to go to their favorite car dealer. They're going to negotiate the best deal that they can for that new 09 or 010 vehicle. And at that point, if they have a clunker that qualifies better than or lower than 18 miles per gallon, the dealer will accept that car, which will be scrapped within, I believe, 48 hours. They'll certify that that'll happen, and the car will be previously owned, operated, and driven for the previous year. And the price, the best price that he or she negotiates from the dealer, will be subtracted by either $3,500 or $4,500, depending upon the new mileage requirements, whether it's better than 4 or 10 miles per gallon. And the consumer then will, 95% of them, will finance that car versus paying cash at that price. They won't pay. Can
I reclaim my time for a second? Because I'm trying to work through this transaction in my head. I take my clunker in, and I trade it in. Normally, that dealer would give me some value for that clunker. And that clunker, oftentimes the used car is worth quite a bit in terms of the overall sale. This used car has no value other than scrap now. So instead of being worth $10,000, it's worth whatever the scrap market is, right?
Well, if the
because they have to destroy it.
If it's worth more than $10,000, chances are, unless you want to be good for the environment like Mr. Shimkus does, you're going to want $10,000 for it, and not the 40, and you won't be eligible to participate with
the reason I ask that is it looks to me, well, I'm going to be out of time here, but
2 minutes.
That the whole. There's more that needs to be thought through on this whole idea, because it looks to me like if I got a trade-in that's 5 years old, so it's worth $6,000 or $7,000.
You'll get that instead. You'll not want to participate in the clunker program. You'll only really want to get it if your value is less than
the $4,000. Right. As long as it doesn't have a taxable consequence.
Right. Gentlemen, time has expired. There are tax issues. We don't have jurisdiction over them. Ways and Means will be reviewing this. And it's not our intention that this be a taxable event, but that's ultimately up to them.
Mr. Chairman, can I strike last word?
Yes.
Yeah, on this whole thing about vouchers as a tax bill and all that, dealers right now and the manufacturers are offering you discounts. Some are equal to this amount here. You don't claim that on your income tax. That's not going to trigger the AMT for you. If you get a discount, you don't say, oh, General Motors gave me this discount, therefore I have to claim it on my income tax. This voucher program is basically the same thing. You don't have to claim it on your tax or afraid you're going to get bumped in a new tax bracket because you got $4,500. That's you don't declare it as income. That's sort of no one envisions it that way. I don't know how you guys come up with that kind of idea.
Well,
go ahead,
it's the IRS code. Would the gentleman from Michigan yield?
Yeah, go ahead.
A lawyer that I wasn't a tax attorney, but the first premise is that there's a difference between negotiating a price down and being handed money. The IRS makes a distinction between that. So if you walked in the dealership and found a $100 bill on the floor, that's taxable income. Whether or not you claim it or not is a different thing. So when you're talking about a voucher where you're being handed money versus a negotiation where a discount is part of the negotiations, that's a whole different item. And so that's why the question of whether it was coming from the dealer or the government makes a difference in this. I yield.
You get it from the dealer, you get it from GM if you get a discount right now. Before this program, go buy one tomorrow. You're going to get some discount. Some of them are as much as $6,000.
The value of the car that you buy, and it's a negotiated. I don't want to argue IRS.
No. Then when you buy the car, every state's a little different. They may tax you. Got to do your sales tax. They may tax you on the total value of the car, not what you paid. Some will tax you on the value of your car minus your trade-in. So every state's a little different. And if you remember correctly, when you fill out your 1040 forms, when you do your IRS, you can actually write off that amount of that sales tax on your federal income tax. So we don't see how it's going to be a taxable event to you if you take advantage of this voucher, which you're probably putting down on your down payment on your car. I mean, I think you guys are really splitting hairs here. It's a good amendment. Let's support it, and let's move on this legislation.
Gentlemen, will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I take a little offense to that because I'm just trying to get an answer, and I've heard from
I'm not.
From the council that it may indeed be a taxable event, and I've heard from the chairman we don't have jurisdiction. They're going to work it out.
How many of you bought a new car and received the manufacturer's discount, counted on your income tax, or put it in there as income from General Motors?
That's the whole point. This is where the government, the taxpayers, are writing somebody a check.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll yield to Mr. Markey.
I'm trying to sort out.
Let me make it, again, very clear. Our intent is for this not to be a taxable event. We are going to work to the best of our ability to make that clear in our bill, and we are going to work with Ways and Means, and we are already in communication with the Ways and Means Committee, and they have made it clear to us that they embrace our goal to ensure that it is not a taxable event. And so at the end of the process, you can have pretty high assurance here that it will not be a taxable event.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Yes, gentlelady from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
I do have a question for the sponsor of the bill pertaining to what will happen when these cars are crushed or shredded and the dealer participation in that. Reading the bill on page 7, where it gives the instructions for the vehicle to be crushed or shredded, and that will include the drivetrain and also the engine. Then a little further over on page 10, it says that the dealer will disclose, or on page 9 it says the dealer will disclose the trading to the person trading in the eligible trade in vehicle the best estimate of the scrappage value of such vehicle, and to permit the dealer to retain $50 of any amounts paid to the dealer for scrappage. So in reading this, I want to be certain I'm able to answer the question that I'm getting from both my new car dealers and my used car dealers about this provision. And that is that the dealer will bear the expense of having that car crushed or shredded. The dealer will bear that expense, and that from that they can strip and sell. Prior to crushing and shredding, they can strip and sell component parts of that car for scrap that they can retain as much as $50 of that. But before they go through that process, they have to tell the individual that is trading that car how much they think they will get from scrap. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes.
Thank you. So then the dealer will be the individual who bears that cost. And I yield to the gentlelady.
As you described it.
Thank you. I appreciate the clarification. Yield back.
Gentlelady yields back the time. Are we ready for the question? Are we ready for the consideration of this amendment? If so, let's proceed to a roll call vote. Those in favor of the Sutton Amendment vote aye. Those opposed vote no.
Mr. Waxman.
Aye.
Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Markey.
Aye.
Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher, aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, aye. Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak, aye. Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Schakowsky? Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Weiner, excuse me. Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Barrow? Sorry, skipped him, didn't I? Mr. Barrow, aye. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Butterfield? Is that him? I know, I'm going that way. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen, aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, aye. Ms. Castor? Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, aye. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Space? Mr. Space votes aye. Mr. McNerney? Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton, aye. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley, aye. Mr. Welch? Mr. Hill, I apologize. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill votes aye. Yeah, we got on that here. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall votes no. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal? Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus present. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Shattuck votes no. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Boyer? Mr. Boyer passes. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts votes aye. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bonomack? Ms. Bonomack, aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry passes. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick? Mrs. Myrick, aye. Mr. Sullivan? Pass. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy, Pennsylvania, aye. Mr. Burgess? Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, no. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, no. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt, aye. I'll do it. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Harmon, aye. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, aye. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Melanson votes aye. Mr. Boyer? Mr. Boyer is off pass on aye. Mr. Terry? Okay, let's see. Mr. Terry, aye.
Have all members responded to the vote? I know that there are some members who serve on the Ethics Committee and have had to excuse themselves to attend a meeting of that committee. And while they may not make it back in time to vote, I hope we will allow them to insert in the record a statement of how they intended to vote on this so they can have their constituents know their views.
Sure. Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, gentleman's status parliamentary inquiry.
I have an amendment at the desk that was structured as an amendment to the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute that is on the same issue as the amendment that was just adopted. I don't see any reason, since she refused the unanimous consent request, I can't offer it as it's currently structured at the desk because it's not, it's to the base bill, but it constitutes an issue that the committee has just addressed in a positive way.
Well, Mr. Barton, we are in the middle of a roll call.
Oh, I thought we had closed the roll call.
Yeah, we were just about to close the roll, but now a bunch of members have shown up, so let's continue the roll call.
Okay. I apologize.
Mr. Chairman, there's I can call their names. Okay.
Please call the roll.
Yes, sir. Mr. Welch. Aye. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Aye. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Where'd he go? Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Aye. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon votes aye.
Are there any other members that wish to respond to the roll? I think the members of the Ethics Committee did get here in time to cast their vote. Without any other responses from members, the vote will be closed and the clerk will tally the vote.
All right. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 50, the nays were 4, and there was 1 present.
50 ayes, 4 noes, and 1 present. The amendment is overwhelmingly agreed to.